Above the iconic White Cliffs of Dover stands an imposing fortress that has guarded the edge of England for centuries. But the history here stretches back millennia. It has seen bloody sieges, brutal imprisonment, and wartime fear, with generations of soldiers passing through and many of them heading towards battles that they would never return from. But then beneath all of that history, quite literally, there is a whole other world. Tunnels carved deep into the cliffs, used for soldiers, hospitals, and secret operations, and later plans for a nuclear war that thankfully never came. But some claim that now the military has moved out and civilians can spend a day there at Dover Castle, it's not just the history that you can experience. There are stories of figures seen where no living person should be, screams and cries echoing through empty spaces with no visible source, and sometimes items physically pushed towards you, moved by unseen hands. But what has caused Dover Castle to become infamous as one of the most haunted castles in the country? Was it one particular tragedy, or by the centuries of fear, violence and loss that have been layered one after the other on this site? And who truly still lingers here once all of the visitors have gone home for the night? Like so many across the UK, the history of Dover Castle goes back far beyond the structure that stands there today, because there was an Iron Age hill fort right here, complete with ramparts and ditches made with the earth. When the Romans came along in AD 43, they also saw the value in this particular piece of real estate, and so they took it over and made it their own, even building a lighthouse here in AD 113 to help ships coming from across the channel. But you can't talk about British castles without mentioning a certain William the Conqueror. Yeah, getting to be as common as Dick Turpin in my stories now. I wonder if King Will haunts anywhere, actually. I'm sure he does. Anyway, in 1066, once William the Conqueror had defeated King Harold in the Battle of Hastings, he captured Dover Port and burned down the town, ready to start again. He built a Norman fortress here, but nothing of that survived. We don't know what it looked like. The castle that we can see today was actually built in the 1180s by King Henry II. And there was a specific reason why King Henry decided to invest vast amounts of money into building Dover Castle, making it the second largest fortress in Britain, the first being Windsor. And it had, in a roundabout way, to do with a murder and trying to save face, basically. Yeah, in 1162, King Henry II made his Chancellor and very good friend Thomas Becket the Archbishop of Canterbury. This is obviously a very high honour, just showing how much Thomas's loyalty and advice meant to Henry. But Henry did have other ideas for putting his friend in this position of power. At the time, the church was effectively a law unto itself. It was controlled by Rome, not the king. Ordained men could only be tried by church courts, even for the most serious of crimes. And year on year, it got richer and more powerful, as it collected more money and property from faithful churchgoers. And so King Henry thought that by putting his loyal friend Thomas Becket at the very top of the English church, he was going to be able to bring it, at least somewhat, under his control. But that was not to be the case at all. On rising to this position, instead of becoming the king's man on the inside, Thomas Becket went all in with the church, going so far as to become convinced that protecting the church from any sort of earthly authority was his sacred duty. King Henry's plan had backfired spectacularly. This resulted in a lot of tension between the two men who had once been really good friends, and it would all come to a head in 1170, after Becket excommunicated bishops from the church who had gone against him. Well, when word reached Henry II with what Becket had done, he was incensed. How dare you? He was going off calling his entire household a pack of miserable curs and traitors, just letting Becket get away with whatever he wanted, probably venting about the whole thing. 4 of Henry's knights overheard their kings ranting and raving and spied a bit of an opportunity to win a bit of favour with the big boss. They slipped away with the aim of arresting Becket, but when they reached Canterbury on the 29th of December, he would not go quietly into that good night. Once it was over, realising what they'd done, they fled, leaving the Archbishop of Canterbury dead in the cathedral. He was quickly seen as a martyr, and pilgrims began travelling to his tomb in Canterbury Cathedral. And just 3 years later, in 1173, Becket was declared a saint. And that was how Dover became significant in a whole new way, because it was a fantastic landing place for people crossing from the continent on this pilgrimage to Becket's shrine in Canterbury. Foreign nobles, churchmen, even royalty were coming to England for this very reason, and they were were arriving through Dover. In 1179, King Louis VII of France came to England to pray at Becket's shrine, and Henry had to receive him at Dover. And that then exposed that while, yeah, Dover Castle was strategically important, when it came to receiving royalty and powerful visitors, it wasn't exactly giving front door to England, rolling out the red carpet. And so that was when Dover Castle was rebuilt on a massive scale, becoming not only this imposing military structure, but also this massive show of royal power and authority. Yes, yes, welcome to England. Come and pray at Becket's shrine. Oh, by the way, have you seen how big our castle is, right? Yeah, that's how big and powerful we are. Look, okay, they didn't have Facebook back then. They had to get creative with showing off. And so if it wasn't for Becket's murder, which, yeah, the king didn't order it, but he kind of got blamed for it, King Louis may not have come to England on that trip, and so Henry may never have given Dover Castle a facelift. But that military power and royal authority would be tested in the 13th century, during two sieges in 1216 and 1217 during the First Barons' War. This was a civil war that had erupted when King John, after signing the Magna Carta and promising reforms, tried to weasel his way out of those promises almost immediately, enraging the powerful barons who had forced him to agree to it in the first place. The rebel barons invited Prince Louis of France to invade. I know, it's another Louis, but different French royal. And Dover Castle became one of the most important targets in the country. If Louis could take that castle, it obviously meant that he could get men, supplies and weapons over into England much more easily. It was exactly the reason that William the Conqueror had secured the coast before travelling up to London for his coronation all those years ago. According to an anonymous eyewitness record from the time of the siege, King Louis's men came at the castle, bombarding the outer defences with siege engines and even mining underneath them. Eventually, the main gate collapsed and the attackers could storm the outer bailey. But once they were inside, they were met with a brutal, bloody close quarters battle. The defenders did manage to hold their own, killing Louis's men and forcing them back out through the breach. Against the odds, Dover did actually hold out. The castle would be rebuilt and expanded after this attack, eventually becoming one of the largest and most sophisticated castles in the entirety of Europe under King Henry III's reign. But it would kind of come under attack again in 1265 during the Second Barons' War, where more rebel barons weren't happy with how King Henry III was ruling. This time, even though the castle was readying itself for another violent siege, it was actually taken by betrayal from within the castle walls. 14 royalist prisoners, so people who were on the side of the king, were being held at Dover by the lady of the castle at the time, Eleanor de Montfort. Now Eleanor, she was already in a super vulnerable position anyway, as her husband, Simon de Montfort, the 6th Earl of Leicester, he'd been the leader of the rebel barons and he'd been killed in battle. These 14 prisoners in Dover convinced the dungeon guards to let them out, where they then fortified Dover Castle against Eleanor. Word got to Prince Edward, King Henry III's son, about what had happened, and that now how Dover Castle was basically ripe for the taking. Just come and grab it. He did, and Eleanor ended up being exiled to the continent, living out the rest of her days as a nun in France. After that, it seems like the castle was kept in reasonably good nick for a good few centuries throughout the Middle Ages. During the Tudor reign, King Henry VIII had the royal apartments all done up, ready to receive his 4th wife-to-be, Anne of Cleves. And then his daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, visited in 1573 and then kept the place battle-ready during the Anglo-Spanish War. Its importance to the crown was starting to decline though, and it was last used by royals in 1625, when the Great Tower was again refurbished, ready for Princess Henrietta Maria to come over from France to marry King Charles I. Clearly wasn't a very good job though, as it was noted that she was, quote, poorly accommodated. But once the royals were done with it, the place was effectively just forgotten about for a few decades. By the end of the 17th century into the very early 18th century, the Great Tower of Dover Castle had been used to hold French and Spanish prisoners, who, during their time imprisoned here, actually scratched graffiti into the walls that you can still see to this day. Dover Castle would get a new lease of life again in the 1740s though, while Britain was under threat of invasion from France. The biggest refurbishment project since King Henry II was undertaken throughout this century, particularly during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. There's rumblings over the channel that you can literally see from the castle. Probably best to just start preparing just a little bit. Maybe start collecting some ammunition and maybe some men as well, and possibly I don't know, draw up some plans, just on the off chance, just in case. Defences were improved and the castle was fitted out to be a barracks for some 800 soldiers, which was a big mass of soldiers in one place for the time. Towards the end of the 18th century, they had started to go underground with the barracks too, tunnelling underneath the castle and creating casemates, these reinforced underground chambers. They had effectively turned the castle back into this formidable, war-ready military fortress again. Once Napoleon Bonaparte was defeated in the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 and the Napoleonic Wars came to an end, Dover Castle's military role was reduced for a while, but it wasn't all the way done just yet. During the First World War, Dover Castle became home to 16,000 troops who were garrisoned here. Some were to defend the town, which had obviously, again, become incredibly important to the security of the country from the continent. But also, it was where many were trained, ready to be shipped out to the Western Front to fight in the trenches. But it was during the Second World War that Dover Castle's tunnels, and the fortress as a whole, would become vital once again. The existing tunnels were brought back into use, but they also built more tunnels both above and below what existed. Just this whole 3-level warren underneath the ancient castle. For good reason though, the area of Dover became known as Hellfire Corner during the war, being so close to occupied France and so under almost constant fire from the Luftwaffe. And so the tunnels gave some sort of protection, while also being able to still utilise this very advantageous location, so close to the enemy, being only about 20-ish miles across the sea from France. So the tunnels below Dover Castle were used as bunkers and officers' quarters, strategic command, being where plans were drawn up to bring the Allied troops back from the beaches of Dunkirk. But also, it was used as a hospital for the wounded and dying soldiers. The level closest to the surface was called the Annex and was where the hospital was. The middle level was the Georgian casemates, and the deepest layer was known as Dumpy. Yeah, you heard that right. Some say that Dumpy meant deep underground military position yellow. I don't know what the yellow was for. But apparently that was not the case at all, and we don't really know where the name came from. Possibly the loads of earth that would have been dumped out to dig the tunnels? I don't know. But even after the Second World War though, Dover Castle was selected to be used as one of the 12 seats of government in the event of a nuclear attack during the Cold War. So the tunnels, again, were prepared for war, but on a much more apocalyptic nuclear winter level. This was going to be where, if the worst did happen, they were going to try and rebuild the country again. Above ground though, obviously it was kind of the point that no one knew what was going on down there. And so ownership of the castle itself was transferred to the Ministry of Works, becoming a scheduled ancient monument. Surely someone at the Ministry of Works would have known about what was going on underground though, right? Or was it more of a, yeah, here you go, here's the keys to the ancient castle, please look after it? What's that you say? Tunnels? What? No tunnels. I ignore those people coming and going through that doorway downstairs. But by the 1980s, it was thought that Dover was basically just too vulnerable. If those big red buttons were pressed, there would be missiles heading straight towards the castle. And so the underground complex was decommissioned in the early 1980s. Thankfully, the unthinkable didn't happen anyway. And nowadays, the castle is managed by English Heritage, and you can visit and walk around the castle and down underground into the tunnels. You can also actually stay overnight in either the Sergeant Major's house or in Peveril's Tower, built by Henry III in the 13th century. Kind of fancy that one myself. Although, I did come across an account from a couple staying there that said that they heard unexplained scratching on the walls through the night. So that's cool. The area of Dover Castle is actually also one of only 3 places in the world where you can see a surviving Roman lighthouse, or a pharos. It has been preserved and restored through the years, so you can see at the top of it, it looks a lot newer. And that's because it was restored in the medieval period to be used as a bell tower for the early 11th century Anglo-Saxon church that it sits next to. But it's still in pretty decent shape otherwise, and it gives you somewhat of an idea of what it would have looked like, compared to the Torre de Hercules in Spain, which was completely restored in the 17th century, or the Leptis Magna lighthouse in Libya, which has very much succumbed to time. So even if you don't want to stay the night in a 13th century tower, it is still well worth a day trip. But it's really only recently, in relation to its lifetime, that it has become this dedicated visitor attraction. They did have bits and pieces of armour and things on display that you could come and look at back in the 1890s, but really it's been this military fortress for centuries, which is unusual, especially thinking about the castles that we've already covered so far. They usually get into the Tudor era, or especially after the English Civil War, and they become palaces or stately residences, aristocratic family seats. They aren't these battle-ready fortifications anymore. But instead, here at Dover Castle, it's kind of seen every side of conflict. It has either directly been a part of it, like the sieges in the 13th century where men were killed right here, or it's garrisoned soldiers here ready for battle, trained them up to fight and possibly not return home again. On the other hand, it's been the place soldiers come back to afterwards with horrific injuries that they may not recover from. Or it's even just been prepared, ready for what very well could have been the end of the world if nuclear war had broken out. And that is a lot of different layers and energy and emotions stacked one on top of the other. And so it makes sense that the ghost stories fit into these layers too, building over time. And I wanted to start with the most famous haunting of Dover Castle, which is possibly the most tragic, but also the most gruesome, because it is said that a young drummer boy called Peter Watkins now haunts the tunnels and battlements under the full moon, accompanied by the eerie sounds of drumming. Imagine if you're down underground, there's a full moon out tonight, and you just hear a drumming sound. But this poor young boy is also seen without his head. I know, what a freaking mental image that is. We have no historical records on this boy, we don't know specifically what happened to him, but the legend says that he was tasked with the very important mission of either delivering a message to his superiors, or he was transporting something super valuable, like his regiment's payroll, when he was ambushed by thieves, attacked and killed. Well, we don't know for sure, it just absolutely breaks my heart thinking about him. Drummer boys were usually around 12 to 16 years old, but he could have been as young as 9. As a lot of the time, official age limits were seen as more guidelines rather than rules. But even so, the fear he must have felt being set upon like that, and to die in such a horrific way, just awful. But the legend goes on to say that now he is seen as a ghost without his head, because when the gruesome crime was discovered, they didn't find the boy's head with him. But now, for over 100 years, people have tried to catch a glimpse of young Peter Watkins. It even made it to the newspapers in 1945, when 53-year-old Sergeant Harry Leeming, being a local, decided that he wanted to put the matter to bed once and for all. Was there really a headless drummer boy? Did he appear marching and beating his drum on nights with a full moon? He needed to get to the bottom of it. So he enlisted the help of able seaman Tommy Hurd, and together they slipped down into the castle tunnels one night in March 1945. Unfortunately, they did not glimpse little Peter Watkins, because they were summoned before the garrison commander and deputy constable of the castle, Brigadier C.W. Raw, who basically told them to get a grip. Ghosts aren't real. So that was the end of their ghost hunt. However, that particular news article went on to talk about previous attempts to contact the little headless boy. It said that 50 years ago, at the time that that article came out, so what would have been around the 1890s, there was a lieutenant of the guards who did go through the proper channels and asked permission to go and find the ghost. He was allowed access, but whether or not he saw Peter, we don't know, because the story went on to say that this poor lieutenant was found the morning after, a complete gibbering mess, with his hair turned completely white. And it didn't matter what anyone said, no one could convince him to talk about what he saw that night. But then also in 1931, an RAF officer wanted to give it a go as well. He did the proper paranormal lockdown, he was shut in the tunnels and the door locked. Basically, there was no escape even if he wanted to. And similarly to the lieutenant, the morning after, this officer was found completely pale and shaken. It took him 3 hours to calm down and be able to string a coherent sentence together, but when he could, he said that yeah, he'd seen something alright. Initially, around 10 PM, he'd settled down to go to sleep, and had pretty much hit the pillow and went. But then, a little while later, he was woken up to the marching sounds of many feet, not just one. He likened it to the sound of an army in rubber shoes. He sat up in bed, listening to this unbelievable noise, when all of a sudden, a woman in a white dress walked into the room. Initially, he just thought, oh, she's real. She must have looked pretty realistic, as all he thought was, oh wow, maybe I wasn't locked in here then? He called out to her, asking, are you okay? Are you lost? Are you in trouble? Do you need help? But the officer said that she didn't reply to him. She just silently glided past him. But as she did that though, she reached out and ran her icy hand through his hair. Now that is a thing. He went on to say that, yeah, didn't see Peter the drummer boy, but you couldn't even pay me £1 million to sleep in there again. Forget it. It was really interesting that no other source talked about this woman in white, but yet here she was as part of the ghostly lore of the castle back in the 1930s and 40s. Instead, one of the most famous ghosts today, alongside Peter the drummer boy, is a lady in red, sometimes called the Crimson Lady. As the name suggests, she is a woman seen wearing a long, flowing red dress, and is usually witnessed around the castle's west stairwell, and also in the mural gallery at the top of the keep. No one can ever get a good look at her face, and they don't really have any details on her dress to be able to tell what time period she's from. But witnesses do mention the sound of a woman crying is sometimes heard whenever she is seen. She does seem to appear to children quite a lot too. I came across a couple of anecdotes where kids would remark to their parents about the lady in the red dress, when the parents would look and there wouldn't be anything there. There was another story of a group of school kids on a trip to the castle, and when they'd all been rounded up to go and eat lunch, one of the teachers realised that they were missing a student. The teacher went back to where she was last seen, the king's bedchamber, and luckily just found her there, happily sketching some of the furniture. Obviously very relieved, the teacher asked the student, are you alright? Did you not notice that you were the only other person in the keep? To which the student replied, saying, I'm not alone. The lady in the red dress was here with me. I'm sorry, what? No, there's no lady in a red dress that I can see. Elsewhere in the castle, a man dressed in early 17th century clothing has been seen around the basement area of the castle keep. In 1990, there was a woman who was doing the morning cleaning around 8:30 AM when she just so happened to look up and see this man standing there staring at her. She said that he was wearing a black, wide-brimmed hat with a plume, knee-length boots, and a purple cloak that draped all the way to the floor. He had dark, wavy hair and a moustache. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just carried on staring at this woman, until after about 30 seconds, he faded into nothing. Does that mean he's happy with the standard of cleaning in the castle going on? Or not? Where does that leave you? After this story came out, he quickly gained this nickname of the Cavalier, because looking like he's straight out of the 17th century, wearing what a royalist during the English Civil War might wear. Although, purple would have been a very expensive colour, so that's quite curious. But sometimes it's not the whole figure that's seen. One really interesting encounter happened again around 1990 when two women were doing the last walkthrough of the castle before closing for the night. All of a sudden, they saw the lower half of a man's body walk past the doorway of what had been the king's bedchamber. Okay. They turned to each other in a sort of, yeah, you saw that too? Yup. So even though what they both saw was pretty impossible, they had a job to do, and so they went to check it out. They walked into the chamber in the direction the pair of legs had wandered off to. They were nowhere to be seen. There was nowhere they could have gone though either. The chamber was a self-contained room, a dead end. You just know that that's going to be something that you go back over again and again for the rest of your life. Did I really see that? What else could it have been? But moving on out by the surviving Roman lighthouse, some have claimed to see a Roman soldier and a monk out there. Not at the same time, I don't think. Although that would be an interesting conversation to be a fly on the wall for. But I also do believe that this is the first time I've come across a Roman ghost that isn't just marching down a road. He got to where he was trying to go, possibly. Or he's stuck there and can't march away. I don't know, but he could certainly be a contender for being the earliest military ghost on this site. But another ghost story, which has most definitely come from part of the military history at Dover Castle, is the ghost of a 17th century pikeman seen walking into the guard room at the furthest end of the tunnels. Only he doesn't use doors or anything like that. No, much too mainstream. He appears into the guard room through the wall, where he then walks across the room, leaving via the opposite solid wall. He was witnessed back in June 1979 when the castle was still under the control of the Ministry of Public Buildings and Works. The member of staff who witnessed him was locking up in the evening at the time, so reasonably early, around 6 PM. But after seeing that, he was completely rooted to the spot for a good 5 minutes afterwards, just wondering, did I really see what I think I just saw. What was interesting was that this pikeman, who was thought to have been from the 1600s, was seen in a part of the tunnels that wasn't built until the late 18th century for the Georgian garrison. Even weirder, there had never been a doorway in the wall where he was seen walking through. When that area was investigated, it was found that before the tunnels had been built, there was an earlier earthwork here known as a spur, which then seems to indicate that this chap was walking through a space as it existed long before the 18th century. As far as I could tell though, he's not been seen again since the 1979 sighting. One that has been seen a little more recently down underground is that of a man dressed in a blue cloak, seen walking the passageways like he knows exactly where he's going. Which is weird because there has also been a figure in blue witnessed above ground in the Castle Keep too. Whether it's the same one or not, don't know. As I was reading about it though, blue is a reasonably close colour to purple. Could it be another manifestation of the so-called cavalier seen in the keep, keeping his nice expensive purple cloak for his Sunday best? Or with red, blue, purple, we got the whole spectrum of colourful ghosts going on here. And we might actually have another one, because there was another group of school children who this time were down in the tunnels drawing. When they handed in their papers to the teacher at the end, they noticed that one student had just written down, "Where is Helen?" Okay. That is very cryptic. When asked about it, he told the teacher and the castle staff that he'd met a man dressed in a green jumper and brown trousers who was looking for this Helen woman. There weren't supposed to be any other visitors down in the tunnels with the school group at the time, and so a full sweep was done, but they didn't find anyone else. And this was very similar to something that was reported on the TV show Strange But True. A medium had been brought in, and in the World War II tunnels, he picked up on the name Helen. The English heritage person that was with them at the time, Clive Boreham, he was not impressed with what the medium picked up, saying that women wouldn't have been in that area, so it just didn't fit with the history. However, a couple of days after Strange But True filmed The Medium, there was an Australian tourist called Annie Sallows that visited Dover Castle. And when she was in that exact area, she had a weird experience. She claimed that a man with blonde hair had come running up to her, this time wearing navy blue, but that he was super agitated, questioning her. He kept asking questions about a woman called Helen, how he desperately needed to find her. Funnily enough, after hearing about what Annie had experienced, Clive was completely blown away. I mean, you've obviously got a question that whether she'd found out from another staff member about what had gone on a couple of days before, massive coincidence, or whether she did actually see this man, wondering where Helen was. It's strange. But true. Sorry, I just couldn't help myself. Other visitors have seen figures dressed in World War II flying gear that look completely real and solid, only the visitors realise later on that there are no costume staff or reenactors down in the tunnels that day. But in 1993, there was a group of visitors and a tour guide who saw a young man in the telecommunications part of the tunnels. Not only that, but later on that year, other people saw him too, with some claiming to actually speak to him. He apparently told them that his name was Bill Billings, and he'd been killed while putting together an amplifier rack right there in the station. Obviously, if true, deaths like that wouldn't really have been made public knowledge, but perhaps this is who at least one of the World War II chaps is. But it is interesting, as something again very similar was reported on Strange But True. There was a tour guide called Leslie Simpson who was taking a group around the tunnels. They'd just reached the Defence Communications Network station, and Leslie was telling them all about the history, about what this part was used for, when all of a sudden a woman on the tour became very distraught and fell to her knees. She quickly got up and, in the most British way possible, bless her, just said, "Oh, I'm fine," and that was that, carry on. Only at the end of the tour, she went up to Leslie and told him exactly what had happened. She'd been watching a man in a naval uniform, tinkering about with the equipment down there. She just assumed that he was a costume staff member, part of the tour, adding to the ambiance, when he turned and started walking towards her. He carried on walking, not even missing a beat, as he walked straight through a barrier and passed through the woman. Yeah, no wonder she fell down. I think my legs would give out having something like that happen as well. In the hospital level of the tunnels, figures wearing white coats or a nurse's uniform have also been seen, even when there are no reenactors or anything anywhere near the area. It does just seem like a lot of the activity happens down underground. And so while as a visitor, if you're walking around the underground tunnels, you will have some idea of what they were used for through the years. So you're almost Not necessarily primed, but you're certainly not under any illusions about how creepy they can be. But there was one American couple who visited Dover Castle, and they were walking through the tunnels, soaking up the history. When they got out, they were so impressed that they just had to remark to staff at the time that they loved the addition of the sound effects down in the tunnels. Really adds to the vibe, like you're right there in the hospital during World War II. Sound effects? What? Yeah, the screaming and crying, right? Apparently, there were no sound effects set up in the tunnels during their visit. So that was very strange. But weirdly, the sounds were heard around the area where the castle was besieged in 1216. So was the couple hearing the echoes of the hospital, or the aftermath of the bloody battle? Or something else entirely, and the sound was just echoing weird? Who knows? Something that definitely isn't just an echo though, was when the stretcher trolley, set out as part of the hospital exhibit, rolled very quickly down the tunnel, as if something unseen was pushing it violently. I see something like that coming towards me. I'll need a real hospital, thank you, but no thank you. But looking into Dover Castle's history and the ghost stories, it was very intriguing that there was a clear difference between two very significant time periods and their associated ghosts. You have the World War II era ghosts, the soldiers, the healthcare professionals, all working in an area of the castle that would have been buzzing with tension during that time. But then you've got even older than that, the little drummer boy, the cavalier, the pikeman. But some believe that that's not the whole story of Dover Castle. It takes a bit more digging, but there appeared to be other ghosts here too, that seem to have been lost to time. I unfortunately couldn't find much more than just the names of these ghosts, rather than what they're reported to be getting up to in the afterlife. But back in the 1940s, there were mentions by the locals of multiple different phantoms. A newspaper article claimed that Dover Castle was haunted by Queen Maud, supposedly imprisoned by feudal barons. The writer also names a crying Mary, described as one of Henry VIII's girlfriends. Saying that out loud, could the woman in red that sometimes heard crying be this crying Mary, maybe? I don't know, that thought has just occurred to me. But then on top of that, there was supposedly a shopping list of, quote, clanking knights, wailing ladies, and swashbuckling courtiers. There are no other details, and the only details we do have are pretty vague and not able to be verified by any history or anything. But I did just find it fascinating that Dover Castle already had this reputation of being a ridiculously haunted place, way before the age of paranormal television shows or YouTubers. But the bottom line for me is that I can absolutely believe that this castle is haunted. And I absolutely adore the fact that it seems to be haunted by all different manner of ghosts from throughout its life. But it is over to you. What do you think of the stories surrounding this place? Have you ever visited Dover Castle and experienced something a bit weird? Something that you couldn't explain? Tell me all of the things. I actually couldn't tell you all of the things. There were a couple of bits that I couldn't include because I'd get into trouble. And so that's why I've started a membership that includes all of the Don't Scare Claire episodes, ad-free and uncensored. It's called the College of the Unexplained, and we're going to be getting up to lots more bonus stuff in there too if you want to join. So there is a link in the description, but if you don't, that's cool too. I'll still be here telling you the history behind the mysteries every week. So make sure that you subscribe, don't want you missing any. But that is all from me today. Go and get some water, stay hydrated. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. I didn't have a single animal come into the room while I was filming today. 139 episodes and they finally got bored and decided that it's not worth coming into the room for. I'm just old news now.